I'm a 28-year-old blonde woman, and I'm often told I look around 18 to 22. I recently went back to college for human resources, so I was on the GO train at 1 p.m. on a Monday to get to a 3 p.m. class. The train comes from outside the city, and it's usually pretty dead during the day when it's not rush hour. I got on the train, walked upstairs, but decided to go to the middle area because someone was humming and I found it annoying. The washroom door was closed the whole time, so I didn't think anyone was in there. I was alone in the middle area, with no one around me. I was sitting with my jacket off, drinking tea out of a bunny mug, with my backpack across from me. I felt completely comfortable because the GO train is typically a calm ride. After about 5 minutes, a man pops out of the bathroom. He was around 22 years old, with white fine-line scars in the shape of a heart and a 3D cube on his face. He puts his hands on my backpack. My first thought was that he was going to try to mug me, and I started planning to punch him in the throat and run, because this wasn't my first attempted mugging. But my body froze when his first words were, "I'm gonna kill my father tonight, and I'm gonna make you help me." He didn't want my debit card. He wanted to hurt me. I currently work in mental health, so I'm used to working with people with homicidal thoughts. I don't scare easily when someone says their voices are telling them to kill me because I feel like I have the resources and rapport with my clients. But I didn't know this man, and I knew right away this wasn't just about thoughts or someone seeking help. This was something far more dangerous. I needed to leave, but his leg was blocking me in. I could hear my voice shaking as I said, "It sounds like you're going through a lot right now. I'm sorry to hear you're upset with your dad. Tell me about it." I grabbed my backpack, but I knew I looked terrified because I could feel that something was really wrong. He replied, "No, you're fucking not, because women like you fucking sleep with my fucking dad, you fucking bitch." He got closer, cornering me into the seat. He said he was going to make me help him kill his dad with a knife because he was tired of pretty women like me ignoring him but sleeping with his dad. He kept asking me why I did stuff like that. At this point, I was terrified, and I realized we were just 2 feet away from the washroom. I was scared he was going to try to drag me in there, and my body was completely frozen. His face got closer to mine, and I just screamed at the top of my lungs, "Help me!" Honestly, I didn't even recognize my own voice. I sounded terrified. 4 random people came running. 1 man, 2 young women, and a middle-aged woman. The man asked if I was okay. The guy across from me put his legs down and started screaming about how I was just a vain woman like all women, and that all I wanted was someone pretty, not like him, as he gestured to his scars. I bolted upstairs and couldn't even speak for a minute. My hands were shaking. I've been in scary situations before, but I was comfortable on my commute, not on guard like I am at work. The man who helped me saw that the guy was still yelling and told me to run towards the customer service train. He said he'd make sure the guy didn't follow me. We pressed the yellow security strip before I left, and the train started beeping, but no security came. The guy who helped me found me later when the train stopped and told me the man had just strolled off the train like nothing happened. However, the 2 young girls who came to my aid had taken pictures of him walking away and gave them to the police. I walked to the customer service train, and the police eventually came, but by then the man was gone. They spoke with me briefly and said they knew who he was because of the scars on his face and because he'd done something similar the day before. They believed he had mental health issues, as if that excused what happened. In all honesty, the police officer didn't seem particularly interested in what I had to say. They asked if I saw a knife. I said no, but it wouldn't have surprised me given the confidence with which he spoke. Still, the officers didn't seem to care much about what I thought. They explained that he had slapped another woman on the train and that someone had seen him with a knife earlier in the ride. Apparently, someone had called the cops before we pressed the emergency strip, but the customer service train guy didn't know that. He only knew about my situation. I just want to say that someone with mental illness can be homicidal, but that's not a symptom of who they are as a person. It's a sign of how unwell they are at that moment. Not all people with mental illness have homicidal thoughts or are violent. I know many kind and wonderful people who have struggled with those thoughts during tough life transitions, and they don't scare me. Maybe this man had mental health issues, but he terrified me. I'm so grateful that people came running when I screamed and that the young girls took pictures, because my gut tells me he would have done something if I hadn't started screaming. The worst part is that the next day, I saw a young woman, maybe 18 to 20, crying at the train station. I overheard her saying she had hidden in the washroom the entire train ride because a man had scared her, and she had to call her parents to pick her up. I have no idea if it was the same guy, but it felt possible, and it bothers me that he's harassing anyone, especially young girls who might be too scared to scream. It's been a few months now, and the police have never contacted me to say if they caught him. He never actually touched me, so I guess it wasn't serious enough for them. But it's left me permanently anxious on my commute. I never sit alone, never take my jacket off, and I'm never really comfortable on the train anymore. This story takes place when I was around 16 or 17 years old. I lived with just my dad in a small apartment in a questionable area. It was the type of neighborhood where you wouldn't want to be out once the sun went down. Up until around 10 or 11 p.m., there would usually be a cop or two patrolling the area to make sure there were no gang-related activities going on. I had a job at a restaurant in the city, about a 30-minute car ride away, or an hour and a half by train. The train station was a couple of blocks from my apartment, and since my dad was always too lazy or hungover to drive me, the train was my main form of transportation. I worked around 3 p.m. and usually got home around midnight or 1 a.m. This was my schedule 4 days a week, in addition to school. I often saw familiar faces on the train, but we never really talked to each other. Until one night. I got out of work late because some customers stayed in the restaurant past closing, causing me to miss my train. The next one wasn't scheduled to arrive for another hour. With nowhere to go and no money for a Lyft or Uber, I sat there waiting. No one was around, so when an older man showed up, staggering a bit, I assumed he was just another drunken hobo trying to catch a train to sleep in. Something about his face gave me déjà vu, but I shrugged it off, thinking I had seen him on the train before. He approached me, much to my discomfort, and started a conversation. He wasn't slurring his words, but the way he was looking down at me gave me goosebumps. He asked why I was out there so late, all by myself. I had to answer to avoid angering him, as we were alone and he was close enough to pull out a knife or something. I told him I was waiting for the train, and he asked which one. The trains were color-coded with strips indicating their direction: north, south, east, or west. I usually took the blue train, but I lied and said I took the green one. He checked the schedule above the benches and saw that the green train was arriving in 15 minutes, so he said he'd keep me company. For those excruciating 15 minutes, he asked me how long I had been working at So-So Restaurant. My blood ran cold. I had never told him where I worked. I just looked at him and timidly replied, "For a year," and he laughed, saying, "Wow, it's already been a whole year, huh?" At this point, my skin was crawling with anxiety. When the green train finally arrived, I knew I had no choice but to take it. I said goodbye, hoping that would be the end of it. But no, he suddenly announced that he was taking the green train too, and followed me on, sitting in the seat behind me. My mind raced with fear, wondering if he was going to hurt me or do something worse. The train car was nearly empty, and the silence was menacing. I could feel his eyes boring into the back of my head. When the train reached a stop where a woman was sitting, I felt a wave of relief. She wasn't boarding, so I quickly got off and sat on the bench next to her, close enough for her to hear and see everything. The man followed as expected and sat near us. He noticed I was sniffling from allergies and asked if I was sick. I told him no, but he insisted on giving me some pills he claimed were cold medicine. I raised my voice and said, "Sorry, I don't accept pills from strangers." This prompted the woman to look at us, and I made eye contact with her. She understood. This continued until a blue train arrived. The woman stood up and gave me a look that said I should get on with her. Without hesitation, I did. She waved me over to sit next to her, and when the man tried to follow, she told him, "No, you go sit over there," making him sit a few seats away. He chose one where he could still face us, staring at me the entire time. I was shaking, on the verge of tears. The woman leaned over and whispered that she had a pistol. I felt a surge of safety. We whispered back and forth, and I explained the situation. I told her where I lived and how I was worried he would follow me home. She assured me that a friend of hers would be boarding soon, and when he did, she introduced him as Ray. She filled him in, and Ray agreed to escort me home. She promised I could trust him. The two of them stayed with me until we reached my stop. The man was still watching me, grinning like the Cheshire Cat. He shouted, "This is your place, right?" I didn't respond. I hugged the woman and thanked her, then hurried off the train with Ray. As I looked back, I saw the woman had pulled out her pistol, blocking the man's exit and telling him to sit back down. I finally let myself cry, overwhelmed with relief. Ray walked me home, trying to calm me by talking about his job and family. After he watched me safely enter the gates of my apartment, I thanked him profusely. To this day, I feel incredibly lucky. I never saw that man again, but the memory of his creepy, aroused smile is burned into my mind. I still wonder just how much he knew about me. I'm a very small, weak woman, 5 feet 6 and 118 pounds. I'm a university student who lives with my mom, and I take my city's subway system to and from school. I've never had any problems with it before. On Mondays and Wednesdays, I have a class that ends at 7:15 p.m. I've never been concerned because the route from my classroom to the train station passes through a segment of downtown filled with high-class hotels. It's well lit with police presence, and many of my classmates also take the same route. However, yesterday I had to use the bathroom after class, and by the time I got to the train station, all my classmates had already left. I keep thinking that if I had just held it, my night would have gone so much better. When I arrived at the station, I sat on a bench to wait. I was wearing my large over-ear Bluetooth headphones, though they weren't playing any music. These headphones are good at muffling outside sounds, even when turned off, so I didn't hear much of what was happening around me. While I was sitting there playing Pokemon on my 3DS, a bald man sat at the other end of the bench. Another guy walked up and sat between us. Out of courtesy, I scooted over without being asked. This new guy started talking to the bald man, but I couldn't hear their conversation. Suddenly, the new guy gave me a friendly pat on the back and said something. I pulled one ear of my headphones off, thinking he needed something, but this guy just babbled at me. I couldn't make out what he was saying because I don't hear well to begin with. Not enough to need aids, but enough that normal speaking voices sound quiet to me. My usual response in such situations is to either ask them to repeat themselves or smile and nod, which is what I did. Then he finally spoke up and asked my name, holding out his hand to shake. I told him my name and reached out to shake his hand, but instead of shaking it, he lifted it and kissed the back of my hand. That's when I knew something was off. He began asking personal questions. My age, if I drink alcohol, and about the game I was playing, commenting on Nintendo's progress. It was an old game. He talked about alcohol for a while, asking how much I drink and sharing how much he drinks. All the while, he sat way too close and leaned over me, speaking quickly and in a tone that was between a mumble and a normal voice. I was incredibly uncomfortable and gave panicked looks at the bald man. He noticed my discomfort, met my eyes, and then just looked away. Creepy guy kept asking more questions like where I lived and which train stop I needed. I avoided answering directly. He mentioned that he needed to get off one stop after Uptown Station, which happens to be my stop. Between where we were at Downtown Station and Uptown Station, there are 5 other stations, so I hoped he'd get off sooner. My train arrived and I quickly said, "Well, this is my train. Bye, sir," and rushed to get on. I fervently hoped he wouldn't follow. At first he didn't, so I sat down in an empty seat and placed my bag on the seat next to me. If I'd known he was going to follow, I would have sat next to one of the women on the train and pretended to know her. But right before the doors closed, creepy guy got on. The bald man, who had seated himself in front of me, smiled and said, "Don't worry, he's a weirdo, but he's harmless." I cannot tell you how angry this made me. Creepy guy may have seemed harmless to him, but I was terrified. I had looked to this bald guy for help multiple times, and every time, he acknowledged my fear by making eye contact, only to look away and chat with other men on the train. Then something happened that I still can't quite explain. When creepy guy asked if he could sit next to me, I froze. My mind screamed no, but my body went into autopilot, moving my bag off the seat. I was trapped between him and the wall of the train. He pressed his entire body against mine. There wasn't an inch of space between us. He kept talking, our cheeks nearly touching. He asked more personal questions, this time about rap music, my dating life, if I had a boyfriend or girlfriend, and if I lived alone. I lied about most of it, obviously. As we neared my stop, my fear intensified. He had already made it clear that he intended to follow me off the train, even though he had said earlier that his stop was one after mine. Finally, my stop arrived. I stood up and said firmly, "Sir, this is my stop, I need to go." He scrambled to move out of the way, dropping a pile of folded papers, a notebook, and an unopened condom packet in the process. I headed straight for the doors, and sure enough, he followed me out. I texted my mom one-handed in my pocket, sending, "Help, man following Uptown Station," but she didn't reply. I called her using my Bluetooth headphones, again with no response. My anxiety surged as I tried to walk faster, hoping to lose him as he gathered his things. But he caught up to me at the escalators. I kept calling my mom to no avail. Once we reached the top of the escalators, I stopped. There was no way I was going to lead him to my condo, which is visible from Uptown Station. He asked which way I was going, and I lied, telling him my mom was coming to pick me up. He insisted on waiting with me, even though I tried to convince him to leave. At this point, I pulled out my phone and openly called my mom. He leaned in close again and said, "Oh, Penny Touraine, I know her. Good-looking lady." He rambled on about how he knew my mom, which was utter nonsense. My mom works as a high-class accountant and has no connection to him. Creepy guy then handed me a piece of paper with his full name, email address, and 2 phone numbers, saying I should call him if I wanted a job. I pretended to agree. He asked for my full name and phone number, so I gave him a fake number. He pressed for my full name, but I insisted my mama wouldn't like that. By this time, I had reached my limit. I shoved the paper at him and said, "I'm sorry, sir, I have to go." I ran down the stairs to the street, still calling my mom. Finally, she called back, explaining her phone had been on silent. I was terrified, looking behind me constantly to make sure he wasn't following. He tried, but I had gotten away. My mom rushed out to meet me, and we met halfway. I've never felt so relieved to see her. We went home together, and she kept an eye out for the guy. I still have the paper with his supposed name and contact info, but I'm scared. I had to go back to those stations today, and the fear that I might encounter him again has stayed with me. Every black man wearing a hat made me jump. Thankfully, that fear eased as the day went on, but I'm still anxious. I don't know what I'll do if I see him again. I work downtown with standard 8 to 5 hours. Once in a while, I work overtime, but not often, and not on the day this happened. It was just a couple of minutes after 5 p.m. when I left work. It's only a few blocks from my office building to the train station. Along the walk, there are a few bars and back alleys, but the worst I've ever encountered are homeless folks who get a bit aggressive asking for cash. They don't bother me much. The train ride from the downtown station to the station where I park my car takes about 40 minutes. If I'm lucky, I manage to get a seat and don't have to stand the entire ride. That day, I was lucky, more or less. I got a seat next to a window, which left the seat beside me open. At the next stop, 3 men boarded. One of them sat next to me, while the others took seats across from me, facing me. I was listening to music on my iPod, so I couldn't hear them clearly. However, I did notice that the man sitting next to me was trying to move closer. He kept shifting until his leg was touching mine, so I scooted away, but he kept edging closer. Eventually, I was pressed against the window, even though he had plenty of space on his other side. I was wearing sunglasses, which allowed me to glance at them without being too obvious. I noticed that they would occasionally say something, then all look at me. It was incredibly creepy and uncomfortable. I felt nervous about getting off at my stop, but mine is the second to last stop on the train line. When the train pulled into my station, I got off quickly. The guy who had been sitting next to me tried to grab my arm, but I was able to pull away and keep moving. I was hoping they wouldn't follow me, but they did. It was a busy station, and I figured they didn't know where I was parked. Unfortunately, they got off the train as well. I guess it was their luck that they'd targeted me. I park in the farthest lot from the station because parking there is free. It's about a 7-minute walk, which isn't usually bad, but that day I was really worried. The lot tends to be quiet, and I was afraid those guys were following me. As a bit of background, I was overweight at the time. Working an office job, sitting all day, and not working out, coupled with a strong sweet tooth, had led to a bad body. I was about 30 pounds overweight and probably couldn't run for more than 30 seconds. It was sad, considering I had run track and played hockey in high school. I still play hockey, but in a women's daytime league, which is more recreational. I'm the youngest on my team by about 20 years, but my mom is on the team, and it's something fun we do together. As I crossed the bridge over the road from the station to the parking lots, I noticed the 3 men were less than 10 feet behind me. I wasn't carrying a knife, though I own a legal-sized one, nor did I have any pepper spray, which is illegal in my Canadian city. However, I knew a bit about personal protection. It was a required class for girls at the private high school I attended, so I put my car key and house key between my fingers in case I needed to defend myself. The men followed me across the main lot, not bothering to hide their presence. The more nervous I got, the louder they laughed. I managed to cross the road between the lots before they did. They had to wait for a couple of cars to pass, so I was almost halfway across the lot by the time they crossed the road. Then, I started to run. I could hear their footsteps pounding the pavement behind me. As I got close to my car, I used my key fob to unlock it. I wrenched the door open, relieved that no one was parked next to me. I barely closed the door and slammed the lock when the men reached my car. They began banging on my windows and yelling, jeering at me. I had never been so afraid in my life. I was worried they'd break the windows and get in. One guy was banging on the back of my hatchback, so I couldn't reverse out of my spot without hitting him. I should have just done it, but I was too scared and not thinking clearly. I screamed, but no one was around to hear me. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't anything good. I wished I had brought the screamer my mom had given me for protection, but it needed a new battery, so I hadn't brought it. That thought, about the screamer, made me realize I had something even better. When you're being assaulted, you're not supposed to scream for help, because no one really wants to get involved. Instead, you scream, "Fire!" because people want to watch a blaze. So I turned on my car alarm. The sound was deafening inside the car, but it had the effect I wanted. The guys started backing off. I saw people entering the lot looking in the direction of my car. Others could see what was going on. The men took off, running back toward the train station. I drove home, crying. The next night I started working out. Since then, I've worked out almost every day. If those cars hadn't been in the road at that time, if I had run just a little slower, if I had been too slow to lock the car, it could have ended so differently. I've lost 20 pounds since then and gained a lot of muscle. I also quit my job. I've had anxiety issues for years, and this encounter made them much worse. I never want to feel that powerless again. I'm a female, in my mid-20s, about 5'7" and 130 pounds. I'm not tiny, but I'm not big either. I work overnight shifts at the airport from 8 p.m. until 4:15 a.m., and I use the train to get from where I park to where I work. Usually I don't feel unsafe because I only travel one stop, to the parking garage employees use, and at that time the train is pretty crowded with employees going to and from work. This morning, however, my husband was supposed to pick me up, but he overslept. So I decided to take the train to a bus stop about 20 minutes down the line, then take the bus to the stop closest to my house and walk from there, about 2 miles. When I first boarded, the train was fairly crowded. I sat near the back and noticed a scraggly young guy chatting with some flight attendants who had gotten on a few doors down. By scraggly, I mean he had long, dirty hair, a scruffy beard, and even though he had dark skin, I could tell his hands were very dirty. Since all kinds of people work at the airport, I assumed the guy worked for the same airline they did, maybe as a mechanic or baggage handler, which would explain his dirty hands, so I didn't pay much attention beyond a quick glance. I popped in my headphones, pulled out my book, and started reading. The train pulled into the next stop, and all the airport employees got off. As the train pulled away, I looked up and realized the train was entirely empty, except for me and the scraggly man. Normally, this wouldn't have been a problem, but he was openly staring at me. Not just a few glances, he was staring, wide-eyed and open-mouthed. I became extremely uncomfortable, but since I was at one end of the train and he was at the other, I tried to go back to reading, hoping he would confine his weirdness to staring. He did not. As soon as I looked away, he started moving towards me. He stopped at the end of my row of seats, turned toward me, gripping the overhead bar, and continued staring. I kept trying not to look at him, afraid that making eye contact would be seen as an invitation to do more than just stare. He sat down in the row across the aisle from me, then got up again and moved to the seat directly behind me. I still refused to look at him, but he must have leaned really close to me because I could feel his breath moving my hair. Then I felt his finger lightly run down the side of my neck. I'm not ashamed to admit that I nearly pissed myself and jerked violently away. Over my music, I heard him hiss like a snake. That's when I decided I was probably just seconds away from getting raped, stabbed, or both. Probably both. The train was nearing another stop, so I made a plan. I got a tight grip on all my stuff, and as soon as the doors opened, I shot out of my seat, out the door, and bolted into the second car. I peeked out the window to see if he had followed me. To my horror, I saw him leaning out the door of the first car, looking up and down the dark, deserted station. Thankfully, he must not have seen me get into the second car because I watched him stomp his foot, mutter something, and pull back into the train just as the door closed. I'm not a lip reader, but it was easy to tell what he said before ducking back inside. Fucking cunt. By the time the train reached the bus station, my increasingly panicked phone calls had woken my husband, and he met me there in the car. I have no idea if the scraggly guy intended to get off at the bus station, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out by enduring a bus ride with him. Since this incident, realizing how utterly defenseless I would have been if he had gone beyond staring and a light touch, I enrolled in Muay Thai kickboxing. I'm only a few weeks in, but I can now throw a mean jab-right hook combo.